Happy New Year. We've made it. I hope last year was excellent, and I hope that next year will be filled with incredible outdoor memories for you. So you may know this about me, but I am not a resolutions person. If I were to say to myself, in 2025, I want to do more pull-ups, that would never work. It just wouldn't. Because I won't do them unless I have a reason for doing them. And fortunately, I do have a mind that swirls with ideas. I always let them live up there for a while. They flutter around like 100 tiny birds. Some of them are loud and really noisy. Some are beautiful and kind of quiet. But even though they all come from my brain, I've come to understand that they aren't all for me. They're not necessarily things I need to follow through on. So I have a habit of just letting them do their thing for a while. Spin around in my brain, make noise, look all shiny for a bit. And some I end up letting fly away. Some are clearly good ideas, and I grab them before they can get away by texting a friend or telling Becca. And some, the really committing ones, stick around, and I try to get to know them. They might wake me up at night, or I find that my brain returns to them when I'm stuck in traffic. It's almost like a stick circulating in a river Redding, going round and round. And I think them through, I let them grow, I let them mature. And in time, whether I just get tired of thinking about them, or I turn some corner where I suddenly have the motivation to see them through, I write the idea down. Because when an idea gets written down, it becomes a goal. And I heard recently that if you write a goal down, you are 40% more likely to realize it. And I don't know if that's completely backed by hard, definitive evidence or research, but anecdotally, that totally tracks. Something changes when you set it down in written words or even just tell a friend. So before we dive into today's episode, I'd encourage you to take a moment, think about that idea rattling around in your head. Does it inspire you? Maybe it intimidates you slightly. Maybe it leaves you a little curious. So I'd say write it down, send yourself a text even, and better yet, send it to a friend, see what they think. Because this is how every great story starts. I'll give you a second. Here, even hit pause. All right, let's go. So it's always been our tradition to celebrate ideas and goals in the new year here at the Diaries. Last year, we had pro skier Cody Townsend. He brought us into the chaos and growth of his multi-year commitment to ski all the lines in the 50 classic ski descents of North America. And there were years past where there were simple little goals that have stuck with me. I mean, I remember one listener maybe 10 years ago brought this seemingly simple idea of drink more water, because they knew that if they were going to be out doing the things that brought them joy, moving their body, exploring new places, they would end up thirsty. And so that was their goal. And it was awesome. It's always stuck with me. So today, to celebrate a new year and new ideas, we bring you a conversation with Alastair Humphreys, adventurer, writer, and connoisseur of the micro-adventure. He's got a new book out called Local, which flips the idea of what it means to explore on its head. Sometimes you can go bigger by going smaller. I'm Fitzka Hall. You're listening to the Dirtbag Diaries. Happy New Year. I love maps. I love paper maps, and I love digital maps too. They're both great, but it really started with a map. Talk to me about how you put this project together.
The best way I think for me to explain Local is to say that I once spent 4 years cycling around the world, and then I spent a bunch of years sleeping on small hills around England, and then I decided to go even smaller by trying to find a tiny bit of adventure in nature and wildness every day. And I think putting constraints on your exploring is a really good way of making it interesting and focused. So the whole of Great Britain is divided up into the sort of detailed maps that you'd use to go hiking in the mountains, called Ordnance Survey maps, and they're really useful, of course, if you're in the wild mountains of Scotland. But equal quality of mapping applies if you live in the middle of London or anywhere. So the whole country's divided up. So what I decided to do was buy the map that I live on, and it's roughly 12 miles by 12 miles, 20 kilometres by 20 kilometres. And where I live, southern England, just outside a big city, it's pretty boring. If you look on my map, like you, I'm a map geek. So when I look on a map, I love looking for contour lines and rivers and bits of forest and great places to camp and adventure. And my map's kind of a bit boring. There's not many contour lines, not many mountains, lots of roads, lots of railway lines, loads of towns. It's really, really built up, certainly by the standards of, say, the American countryside. So it looks pretty boring. But I decided to commit to spending a whole year only exploring this map, 20 kilometres by 20 kilometres. And I could have just thought, right, I'll just go wander around my local map for a year, but I need a bit more structure than that. Otherwise, I tend to give up projects. So the map's divided up into 1 kilometre grid squares. So my idea was each week I would choose one grid square at random. The random part's important, maybe we'll talk about that in a minute, but choose one grid square per week, and I'd go out to this grid square and attempt to see everything in that square. Every footpath, every street, every bit of woodland, whatever. And I would take my camera with me in order to force myself to slow down, because I'm a kind of hyperactive guy. I do a lot of running and biking and stuff like that. But I thought if I had a camera, it would force me to slow down. And really importantly, what I wanted to try and do was switch my mindset to be interested by everything. And I mean literally everything. You see a pile of trash by the road, rather than just going, oh, that's ugly, I try and get down on my knees and take a beautiful photo of it. And I try and ask myself, why is it here? And try and learn about literally everything I saw. And at the start of this year, I worried that one small map would be far too claustrophobic for me for a year, and it would be really boring, and I'd see everything and it would be rubbish. But I soon realised that once you start to pay attention in this sort of detail, you can't possibly begin to get to know even 1 square kilometre, let alone a whole map. So by the end of the year, I'd been to 52 out of 400 grid squares in great detail, which means I would still need another 6 years if I was to even see every square on my map. So suddenly, this tiny, small little map suddenly grew into a huge possibility. And I think if you're curious enough, then perhaps a single map might be enough exploration for an entire lifetime.
Where did the idea for Local come from?
The idea from Local has just been an evolution of my adventuring getting ever smaller over the course of about 20 years, I suppose. My original inspiration for adventures was wanting to see new places, to find exciting things, to be surprised, all that sort of discovery stuff which encourages young people to go and want to see the world. And that didn't really change as I made my adventures smaller towards trying to do what I call micro adventures, which was about still trying to pursue the same ideas of adventure, but on a smaller scale that was more accessible for more people in more places more often. And then Local is just another progression downwards. I do slightly worry I'm just getting old and lazy, but it was more of a question for me of trying to see, could I find some small pocket of curiosity and discovery and newness and surprise literally every single day, rather than having to wait for the weekend to go have a micro adventure, or wait until I've saved up time and money for the next big adventure. It was, what can I find every single day? And it was also an attempt to try and flip my mindset a little bit. I live in a fairly boring part of a fairly boring country. I've always been yearning to go off and be off on big adventures, but the nature of life is that you spend more time at home and not that much time away. So I tried to think that it was time to flip it around a little bit and try to look more positively and curiously at where I lived. So rather than just moaning that I was at home and wishing I was on an adventure, maybe I could try and find some tiny little fragment of adventure every single day right here where I happen to be right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm curious, how did the young man who pedaled 46,000 miles around the world, who crossed the empty quarter, in my mind, I would really say embodied the idea that you shape life to make it what you want to be, live in a place that you loved leaving? Like, how did you end up where you were?
Well, I suppose there's a couple of elements to that. One, I think, is just the nature of my personality, in that wherever I happen to be in life, I mostly am getting excited about leaving it and heading to the next horizon. And I see that as a fairly unsatisfactory character flaw in myself. Rather than just accepting where I am and enjoying it, I'm forever yearning for the next horizon. And that, I suspect that would be slightly true wherever I happened to live. And then the other aspect of the literal one of how come I'm somewhere that I don't particularly like, it's just life, family commitments and real life and stuff like that. End up meaning that I'm not living in a log cabin in the mountains of Montana. So it's just real life, which I hope is what makes the microadventures and this local project relevant to everyone, not just the sort of very niche adventure community, because most people are living some sort of slightly compromised life rather than in a log cabin in the mountains of Montana.
Yeah. It's so funny too, because I feel like sometimes the reality is that that's our instinct is to be, that's the grass is greener over there, of imagining this sort of, oh, if I were in this place, it would all be perfect. And that this side of me that has this yearning or this striving or this sort of, like kind of antsy feet would go away. What I hear you saying is that is actually probably a function of our characters more than it is a function of our situations.
Yeah, I think so. There's two fancy phrases that I think are relevant. One is hedonic adaptation, which essentially is how you think, oh, if I only get that new, more expensive mountain bike, then I'll be really happy with life. And you get that new bike, and a few weeks later, you've forgotten about it, and you're just riding your bike like usual. And the second is the paradise paradox, which is often discussed in terms of people living in mountain towns, of that very notion of thinking, if only I lived there, then all my problems would be solved. But the trouble with your problems is that wherever you go, they tend to follow you. So the best thing to do, surely, is to try what I've been attempting to learn to do a bit belatedly in life, which is to accept and appreciate and be curious and adventurous about where I happen to be right now, and to try and see adventure as being more about your attitude than about the geography of where you are.
Mm-hmm. Talk to me about that point in your life when you were younger, because I think you were, I would say that if there were a career path for being an adventurer, you certainly were on it, especially at that time, which is kind of like the early aughts, where you did this incredibly low budget 4-year ride around the world. And then, you sort of got a little bit more sophisticated with some of the expeditions. They took more funding. You were reaching out to corporate sponsors. You were doing corporate speaking. You were kind of on this pathway. When you reflect back now at that chapter, are those still some of the greatest memories of your life? Like, do you miss that time sometimes? Like, talk to me about that.
Yeah, very much. I look back on my more youthful, bigger expeditions as being some sort of glory days of my life. But I would hope that a lot of people look back on their previous decades with that sort of nostalgic tint of, wow, that was epic and wild and what a ride, and it was great. And yeah, I absolutely loved saving up and going off on the first really cheap dirtbag expeditions. And then I found it incredibly exciting when I started to get paid to write a magazine article, or someone bought one of my photographs, or they paid me to come and do a talk. And little by little I got to the point where I could pay for my next adventure by doing this sort of stuff and turning the wild adventures into a career. And there's a lot of pros and cons about making your hobby into your job, but by and large I loved it, because I loved not only the adventures, but I also loved the creative work side of the life as well. So it was absolutely fantastic. And essentially I'm still kind of doing that now, but rather than making my money from talking about crossing an ocean, I now do talks about walking down to the local supermarket and looking around the back and seeing if I can find any nature. So it's funny. It's funny, the evolution of a career.
That is funny. You first came out on my radar because of your micro adventure idea, and I just remember it felt super akin to kind of what I was doing, where I saw in the space is that at that time there was this big emphasis of like, for something to matter, you need to go to the end of the earth. Or for something to be important or life-changing, you had to do something that was super remote, super difficult, took an incredible amount of resources in terms of time or fundraising. And at the same point, I was like seeing all these people that were doing things incredible, like just having incredible adventures in their home mountain ranges or just in a region. They were like falling in love with the place. And that was sort of one of the emphasis of creating the Dirtbag Diaries originally. So when I saw your micro adventures, I was like, yes, that's kind of what we were trying to do. Will you explain to me how you got to that stage? The micro adventures, like how did that come about and what happened? And explain to people what that was. Find out after the break. Hey everyone, it is that time of year. We need your shorts, your stories, because you power this show. We hear from so many of you that one day you're going to submit your short and send it to us at the Diaries. Guess what? That moment, it could be right now. So make it a New Year's goal or use it as an excuse to take a break from Uncle Joe at the holidays. You make this community, your voice is valued. You can find all the information you need at our website, dirtbagdiaries.com. Click on the Write Us tab where you can find instructions and the submission form. Pay attention to it. It helps the cause. Trust me. Link is in the show notes, so take a moment, click on it, consider it, and then get to work. You've got until January 19th to send us your short. Once again, it's dirtbagdiaries.com/write us. Thanks. Do you have a resolution to adventure outdoors more this year? Make it happen with Sierra Club Outings. Leaders in conservation-focused active outdoor adventures, Sierra Club Outings hosts over 250 small group trips every year where you can backpack, kayak, raft, volunteer, and more. These trips fill up fast, so reserve your spot at sierraclub.org/outings and use the code DIRTBAG to get $100 off. With Sierra Club Outings, it's more than just a trip. It's an adventure with a cause. We'll put a link in the show notes. Check out all the incredible trips they have and make that resolution happen. Will you explain to me how you got to that stage? The micro adventures, like how did that come about and what happened? And explain to people what that was.
So when I first got interested in adventure and expeditions, it was through reading books of all the classic expeditions and explorers through history. And so when I started doing my own adventures in my early 20s, I was really striving and ambitious towards trying to be elite, to be tougher than you, to do something harder than you could do, to sort of prove myself to myself, essentially. But I really felt that the merit of an adventure was on how tough it was and how difficult and epic it was. And I loved that side of adventuring. And I was doing that sort of stuff for a few years and very much enjoying it. But I started to realize that there's a lot more people who enjoy adventures than who are doing that sort of epic stuff. And the reason for that, of course, is that real life applies to 99% of the world. So, I'd go to some town and I'd do a talk and there'd be a big audience. Hundreds of people would be there listening to these stories, hopefully enjoying them, but clearly not going to go off and cross deserts next week because they had to go to the office. So I started thinking, everyone likes this idea of adventure, but how can I try and find a way to make this achievable for real people with real lives? So what can I take about the stuff that I love about the big adventures and shrink it down into some sort of smaller, shorter, simpler, cheaper versions, but still retaining a little bit of the magic of adventures, simplify it down. The essence, I suppose, being that it's better to have a little bit of adventure than no adventure at all. And so I started doing these small little things, which I called micro adventures. And I chose that word because I wanted to deliberately embrace the smallness of them, to say it doesn't matter how small your adventure is. If it feels like an adventure to you, then that's valid. Just because it's less epic than what Bear Grylls is or Alex Honnold are doing don't let that demean it. If it feels like an adventure to you, then that's great. And so I started doing these small little micro adventures. But at first, I very much saw them as a little sideshow whilst I got on chasing the big stuff. And it's so interesting looking back, because I worried at the time, and this probably just shows my youthful masculine insecurities, but I very much worried that by trying to now spend a year sleeping on my local hill just outside London, that my fledgling career was going to collapse, and that no one would think I was cool anymore, and all these sort of insecurities of that. And so I thought the micro adventure thing would just be a little flash in the pan, and then I could get back to chasing my ego around the world. But what I've learnt with hindsight is that actually micro adventures are much, much more interesting than yet another middle-class white man showing off about himself, and that they're much broader, and it's made adventure more accessible to more people and has much more depth and in many ways richness than the stuff that I was doing earlier. So yeah, I certainly didn't expect that I'd still be talking about them 15 years after I first started sleeping on my local hill.
For those people that you were talking to at those lectures, that, you know, obviously it was like right at that time where social media was really sort of taking off at its golden age. It was like a really good way for people to connect in honest ways. And you saw people grab that idea and run with it. And was that just a quick moment, or was that something that's sort of been sustained throughout time, like that idea? Like, are you still seeing, you know, people tagging you or you know, that hashtag micro adventure? Because it was something that took off.
Yeah, it was really exciting when the hashtag in the early days of that started to grow, and I'd see people who I didn't know. That's always a good sign when people you don't know are doing stuff that you're talking about. Random people, families, people in different countries, old people, young people, out of shape people going off to sleep on their local hill. And that was fantastic. I mean, people have always done this sort of stuff, wild camping, biking, all these sort of things. But I think what was helpful here was giving it a name just helps bring together an imaginary community, because it's suddenly you're like, yeah, that's the sort of thing I want to do, or that's the sort of thing I already do. And once you start to see people like you doing things like this, it makes you more inclined to try it yourself. So it's really rewarding to start seeing that sort of thing happening. But I did still think that it would just be a little thing that would go away and then I'd carry on with life. So it's been great that it's continued. And I suppose the real validation of it was when I started to see a couple of brands using the word in ways that I really strongly disapproved of, essentially just trying to flog people holidays and stuff. But that, in a sense, is when you know that the word's done quite well, when it's being taken over and abused like that. It used to sell hotel vacations. That was the thing that really thought, wow, this word has grown beyond what I thought it was going to be.
There's this one moment in local that I loved. You live in a place at the intersection of the suburban world and the rural area. And there's this great portrait, this photo of you that this little boy took. Tell me how that photo came to be.
So one of my assumptions before I started this project was that the parts I would enjoy the most would be the beautiful bits of nature, you know, being out in the countryside. That's the kind of thing that I like, so I thought that would be the good part. But where I live, just outside the city, there's lots of problems with people just dumping trash by the road, and I mean on a fairly big scale, like builders, workmen just dumping a whole lorry load of stuff by the road rather than paying the council, the local officials to take it away. They just dump it by the road. It's called fly tipping in the UK, and it's really ugly and it annoys me a lot, but you see it everywhere. So I found this giant pile of it just outside a traveller community. Now the travellers, I suppose, need a little explanation. It's that they're probably the demographic of people in Britain that are it's still the most socially acceptable to stigmatise against, in the way that you wouldn't think of talking about black people or Asian people or something, but the traveller community, which have got a long heritage through Irish travellers and all the way back to Romany gypsies, as sort of almost a sort of semi-nomadic lifestyle, although these days tend to live in small communities. They're very marginalised, they're stigmatised, people are really prejudiced against them, and one of the regular accusations about them is that they go around leaving a mess wherever they happen to go. And I suspect that the fact that this massive dumpster pile of rubbish was just outside their community there might be some sort of correlation between the two. Anyway, the council were there clearing up the rubbish, and they were furious because they just do this all the time and it drives them mad. And these two young traveller kids came, and so I was chatting to them and chatting to these kids. Essentially, at first, I was saying to them, "Hey, why? I was wondering, why aren't you guys in school? They quite often don't go to school that much." And they were asking what I was doing. They were suspicious of me. "What are you doing here with your expensive camera? Why are you near our community with this camera?" They're quite suspicious of outsiders. And so I explained to them that I was trying to find local wild places and things, and they started to be quite interested now. They're like, "Oh, if you want, we can show you. There's a pond down there. There's big fences. It's keep out, but I can show you a way to get in. We can show you that. Do you want to come with us and we'll show you our horses?" So they were interested that I wasn't just being dismissive of them, and they wanted to show me. They had some pride in their local area. So I was chatting to them. I happened to have some slingshot pellets in my pocket, which is quite a random thing to do, but one of my many procrastination devices for not writing books is that I fire my slingshot at squirrels out of my shed window. So I happen to have very badly at it, by the way. They're perfectly safe squirrels. I had these slingshot pellets in my pocket, and the kids had made their own handmade wooden slingshots. Beautiful handmade thing. And so just by the coincidence of me having these in my pocket meant we could bond. It's like, "Hey, here's some slingshot pellets, have a go." I was showing them my fancy camera. The officials were like, "Hey, don't let those guys have your camera, they'll definitely steal them." The sort of preconceptions and prejudices, but I trusted these little kids. They took my photo and we had a nice chat. And what was really good about that whole experience was me having conversations with the sort of people I don't normally do. More importantly, the realization that everyone is curious and interested in their local area if you show an interest in it. So if you're interested in other people, they'll respond to that, they'll warm to it, and it was a really nice positive interaction.
What I love about that too is that sounds like a story you could have told me from your bike trip around the world. Like, you could have changed the name of the country, and that would have sounded like that could have happened in Guatemala. It could have sounded like it could have happened in Japan. Like, that was your thesis, is that this is possible to kind of find moments like that. There could be the cynical side of being like, well, you just had to write a book and come up with something. But like that actually sounds like a real thing. And I'm curious, like, how often did you find that real thing? Because that ultimately was your thesis or your hypothesis for doing the whole project.
So one of the great things that I learned from cycling around the world was that everyone is interesting. Everyone's got a really cool story if you're just interested in them. And I've always loved going off to far off parts of the world, and I find everyone fascinating. If I get in a taxi in Pakistan, I just love talking to the taxi guy, and it just seems so fascinating. Or I go into a bread shop in Bolivia, and I love the way they make bread. It makes me so excited. And then I have this attitude, and I come back to England, and I get into a taxi, and I'm like, I'm not going to talk to this guy. This will be a boring conversation. Or I go into a bakery, and I think, boring bakery. This really negative attitude to the universe that I don't have when I'm off traveling. I'm a curious, cheerful, outgoing, enthusiastic sort of guy. So one of my things that I really tried to switch my brain into for this local trip was to go out each week with that same sort of curiosity that I would have in a far off country. But England is just as interesting. We're talking now, you're thousands of miles away. If you suddenly flew to my town and I walked down the street, you'd be like, wow, look at all these funny, interesting English things. Yeah. So I was trying to take that curiosity of being a traveller of the world and bringing it to my backyard once a week, every week, to try and build some new habits within myself.
Yeah. You've learned an immense amount about your home. And that was clear in the book. Like, I appreciate it just even on the level of like, what's happening in the fields? Why is the British pub in decline, right? The workings of nature, the people that live their lives around you. And what did you learn about the concept of home? And then also, what did you learn about yourself?
I learned that home is more of a choice of attitude and a choice of perspective. It's something that I've always very much yearned for. Whenever I'm away on distant expeditions, I'm very much dreaming of home, of stability, of community, of being known, of not being a stranger, all those really good things. My personal trouble is that once I get home, I quite quickly get bored by all those and dream of being a reckless stranger out on the distant horizons. What I learned from doing this was that choosing to accept where I am and to look at it really fresh and open eyes every day just brought forth wonders. I started to learn about the birds and the trees and things close to where I live. I started to learn about local history, and gradually peeling back the layers on so many things just reveal how many new things there are still to discover. So I think the more you're curious about your home, the more interesting your home will become. And then what I've learned about myself is to remind myself that I do need to slow down, and slowing down out in the outdoors and in nature generally makes me a better, friendlier, kinder, more patient, calmer person. And therefore I shouldn't associate spending time out in the outdoors on my bike and stuff as a frivolous waste of time when I should just be working, but actually is a really essential part of me becoming a rounded and semi-decent human being.
Will you talk to us a little bit how you closed out this year-long adventure? I think originally you thought, like, how do I get out of this square that I've been chosen to be in for a year, and yet you flipped it on its head and you figured out how to come closer to the center of it. Talk to us about that.
At the start of the year, I was worried that exploring one small map would be really claustrophobic and restrictive, and that I'd actually be just yearning to bust away and go far away, and I thought I'd see everything. But by the end of the year, I'd written about 52 grid squares out of 400. So suddenly I felt a fraud to be claiming to be an expert on my local area when I'd only seen actually a tiny percentage of this place that is really my local backyard. I've been all over the world, but there are places 5 miles away from my home that I haven't been to. So it felt kind of fraudulent to be writing this book about being a so-called expert. So I decided for my final chapter that I would go and see every single grid square on my map. And also, this was a good excuse for my old adventurous self to get out my bicycle and my tent and stuff and go on a bigger adventure close to home. So my idea was to start in the very top corner of my map and cycle through every grid square round and round in a spiral of grid squares, round and round, finishing right at the centre of my map at home. 400 squares, I had about 4 days spare to do this, and it came to be about 300 miles. And I found this really entertaining. 300 miles on a bike, that's quite a big adventure. But the nature of going round and round like this meant I was never actually going to be more than about 7, 8, 9 miles from my bed and my refrigerator. So it seemed like a funny way to do a big adventure, but it was great. And as I set off, it just felt like the old days of going around the world, where you wake up in the morning and you cycle for hours and you're seeing new stuff, but you're kind of just looking forward to lunch and you don't know where you're going to sleep that night, and you see things you've never seen before, just like the good old days of adventure. But with the added twist this time of every so often I'd be in a square like, I remember this place, and look, this is how this square connects to this square, bringing more connections together even than I'd had in this year of looking so closely. And round I went. And what astonished me was how much of my map I'd never seen before in my life, even after 15 years of micro-adventures, plus a year just on this local map. There was so much I'd never seen before. And I found that a really fascinating way to end the adventure. And then I had 4 days in which to do this. I clearly am getting old and lazy, and I spent far too much time going to cafes along the route. So I didn't even finish. I had to quit and come back home. But I kind of liked that, because that meant that even after this grand expedition around my local map, there was still some grid squares that I haven't been to. So, gosh, there's so much exploring to do close to home. I kind of liked that I failed on my big adventure at the end.
Yeah, how many are left? Do you know?
I'm not an organised enough person to know precisely, but it's like a fractal. The more you look, the more there is. So, for example, if I could go and do that exact same route, but in the middle of winter time, and I'd see snow and different things like that, or I could go and do it at night time, and I'd see owls and see the stars and things. There's so many different ways of seeing things that are seemingly familiar. So the more you look, the bigger and bigger this map grows. It's like some sort of Alice in Wonderland mind bender.
Many thanks to Alastair for coming on the show and giving me, and hopefully you, a dose of inspiration for the new year. You can find out more about his adventures and pick up a copy of his new book, Local, at alastairhumphreys.com. There's a link in the show notes. Our stories come from friends of friends, and from you, our community. If you have a compelling idea for a guest or a story lead, please do not hesitate to give us a shout. You can email us at editor@ducktapethenbeer.com. And as a reminder, we're accepting submissions for the shorts right now. That could be your goal, right? You could have your story on the diaries. You can find the submission details in the show notes or on the website dirtbagdiaries.com. Music today from Boye and Brennan O'Connell. The tracks are courtesy of the artists or Track Club. Jacob Bain and Nis Cotto composed our theme song. This episode was produced by Marco Seiler Gonzalez and me, with additional production help from Becca Cahal, who also is our executive producer. Illustration by Walker Cahal. I'm Fitz Cahal. You've been listening to Dirtbag Diaries. Happy New Year.